Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into something huge, something that's dominating global discussions, the fourth industrial revolution.
It's everywhere, isn't it?
Absolutely. You look at the 2018 BRICS summit, the theme was literally collaboration for inclusive growth and shared prosperity in the fourth industrial revolution. And President Xi Jinping in China often talks about these technological shifts as historic turning points.
Right, framing them in that grand historical arc.
Exactly. And here in the U.S., you hear policymakers, President Biden talking about needing to own the future, the NSCAI report comparing AI to electricity. There's this real intensity.
A sense of urgency, definitely.
But the question we want to dig into today is, how does this actually work? How do these tech shifts genuinely reshape, economic power between nations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And it's what Jeffrey Ding tackles in his book, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers. It's fascinating because his core argument, well, it really pushes back against the common wisdom.
Oh, how so?
He argues that winning these transitions isn't mainly about being the first mover, the first to invent the big thing. It's much more about how effectively a country adopts and spreads what he calls general-purpose technologies, GPTs, across its whole economy.
Okay, GPTs.
Yeah, and that effective spread is what lets one power sustain higher productivity growth than others. That's the core of an economic power transition as he defines it.
Okay, let's unpack that right away. This distinction sounds crucial. What's the difference between that traditional view Ding is arguing against and his GPT idea?
Right. So the traditional view often leans on what he calls the leading sector mechanism, or LS. Think heroic inventors, breakthrough innovations in just a few specific new industries.
Like cotton textiles or steam back in the day?
Exactly. Those sectors, boom, the innovating country gets these sort of monopoly profits, and that's seen as the engine of their rise. It's very focused on that initial invention, that spark.
The brilliant individual, the eureka moment.
Precisely. Now, the general purpose technology, or GPT mechanism, is different. It's about technologies like, say, electricity or maybe AI today that can transform countless industries.
Okay, much broader impact.
Much broader. But here's the key. Their real power isn't just the invention itself. It takes time. It requires lots of other smaller, complementary innovations, and it has to spread widely through the economy, often with a significant time lag.
So it's not the initial flash, but the slow burn across everything.
You got it. Kevin Kelly from Wired had that great quote, "Everything that we formerly electrified, we will now cognitize." That captures the pervasive nature of a GP like AI. It's about application everywhere.
That really does drive it home. So if we're comparing these two ideas, leading sectors versus general purpose tech, what are the key tests? How does the book measure which one fits history better?
Good question. Ding lays out 4 key differences to look for when examining historical power shifts.
Okay.
First, impact timeframe. LS impact is front-loaded right after the invention. GPT impact, because diffusion takes time, is actually bigger later on.
Right, that makes sense. Lopsided later.
Second, phase of relative advantage. LS is about having that initial monopoly on innovation. GPT is more about having an edge in diffusion, being better at spreading and using the tech.
Innovation versus adoption, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. Third, breadth of growth. LS growth is concentrated in those few hot sectors. GPT growth is dispersed. It lifts productivity across many, many sectors.
More pervasive.
Exactly. And finally, number 4, institutional complements. LS needs institutions that support the star inventors, deepen that specific innovation skill. GPTs need institutions that widen the skill base, creating lots of capable engineers and technicians to spread the tech. Coordinating knowledge becomes key.
That's a really clear framework. Okay, I'm eager to see how this plays out. Let's go back to the first industrial revolution, say 1780 to 1840. Britain's rise. The story we usually hear is cotton, steam power, heroic inventors.
Right, the classic LS narrative. James Watt, Richard Arkwright.
Yeah. How does that narrative hold up under this GPT lens?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Cotton textiles did boom early on. Massive export growth, like you said. Output increased something like 2,200% between 1770 and 1815. Huge.
Sounds pretty LS-like so far.
It does, but here's the catch. Britain's sustained productivity growth, the thing that really cemented its dominance, took off later, mostly post-1808, really solidifying after 1815. And the steam engine. Despite Watt's patent in 1775, adoption was surprisingly slow.
Really? I always pictured steam engines everywhere right away.
Nope. By 1800, Manchester, the booming industrial heartland, only had about 32 steam engines. Its really broad economic impact didn't hit until after 1840, and that was thanks to complementary innovations like the Lancashire boiler, which made it much more efficient and practical to use widely.
Ah, okay. So the timing's off for the standard LS explanation for both cotton and steam being the immediate drivers of the big productivity surge.
Exactly, the timeline doesn't quite fit.
So if it wasn't primarily those famous leading sectors driving the sustained surge, what was it?
The crucial driver, Ding argues, was the widespread diffusion of advances in iron machinery. Basically, mechanization spreading across many different industries. Britain's real edge came from its GPT skill infrastructure.
GPT skill infrastructure. What does that mean in practice?
It means they developed this wide pool of competent machinists, people who could build, install, maintain, and improve machinery. There was a shared technical language, practical know-how.
Not just the geniuses, but the people who make it work day to day.
Precisely. While France had elite engineering schools like the École Polytechnique, their knowledge was often theoretical, kind of divorced from practical applications. They trained brilliant minds, but too few actual practitioners to spread mechanical skills broadly.
Interesting contrast.
Yeah, and Britain's strength was partly in these informal networks, mechanics institutes, technical societies. There were over 1,000 mechanics institutes by the mid-19th century. They were crucial for spreading practical knowledge.
So it's the diffusion, the practical skills, the widespread technical literacy. That's a different picture. Okay, let's jump forward. Second Industrial Revolution, 1870-1914. The U.S. overtakes Britain. Again, the usual suspects are steel, electricity, chemicals, cars, German and American innovations.
Right, another period often framed through that LS lens.
Does the GPT perspective change our view here too?
It really does. The U.S. didn't just become the biggest economy, it became the clear productivity leader. But the evidence shows this wasn't primarily driven by just a few R&D-heavy leading sectors. Chemicals, for example, big focus of innovation, employed tons of scientists, but accounted for only about 7% of U.S. total factor productivity growth later on. TFP is that measure of overall economic efficiency, remember. So big disconnect there between the flashy R&D sector and the broad productivity gains.
Okay, that is counterintuitive. So if it wasn't mainly chemicals or these other high-profile LS sectors driving the overall U.S. surge, then what was the engine? This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It absolutely is. The U.S. ascent was powered by the incredibly effective diffusion of interchangeable manufacturing methods. Think mass production. And this was underpinned by major advances in machine tools, the machines that make machines.
The tools to make the tools. Okay.
And crucially, the U.S. led massively in the adoption and spread of electricity.
Yeah.
By 1912, U.S. electricity production per person was double Germany's and 5 times Britain's. They didn't just invent things, they used them widely.
So the productivity growth was broad across the board.
Exactly. Broad, pervasive, affecting huge parts of the economy. Even the service sector started showing gains. That points strongly towards dispersed, GPT-driven growth, not concentrated LS growth.
What allowed the U.S. to do this diffusion piece so much better than Britain or Germany at the time? What were the key institutional differences?
The U.S. really focused on broadening and, importantly, systematizing mechanical engineering skills. Think land-grant colleges, technical institutes. They aim to train a wide base of practical average engineers, integrating hands-on skills with theory.
Not just the elite theorists.
Right. Britain, in contrast, was still very tied to traditional apprenticeships, which slowed things down. And Germany's technical schools, while excellent, often prioritized theory over the practical application needed for adopting advanced machine tools quickly.
And the numbers bear this out.
Oh, dramatically. By 1900, the U.S. had something like 4,459 students in higher mechanical engineering programs. Britain, adjusted for program lengths, maybe had 400. That's a huge difference in the sheer number of people equipped to implement and spread these new methods.
Wow, that paints a very clear picture building the workforce for diffusion, not just invention. Okay, let's fast forward again. Late 20th century, Third Industrial Revolution. Japan's challenge. I definitely remember the headlines, the fear almost that Japan will overtake the U.S. They were dominant in consumer electronics, semiconductors,
Right.
Classic leading sectors, right?
Absolute classic LS examples. And this case is fascinating because it strongly disconfirms the LS mechanism as the primary driver of power transitions.
How so? They did lead in those sectors.
They did. And Japan saw incredible TFP growth initially, around 2.4% a year from 83 to 91. Remarkable. But the predicted economic power transition just never happened.
Right, the lost decade followed.
Exactly. Japan's TFP growth basically flatlined in the 90s, averaging only 0.2% a year. And incredibly, By 2002, the GDP per capita gap between the U.S. and Japan was actually wider than it was back in 1980.
That's astonishing. So Japan won the leading sector battle but lost the economic war, so to speak.
Mm.
Why? If they had the hot sectors, what went wrong according to the GPT framework?
They fell behind the U.S., where it counted most for broad productivity. The diffusion of information and communications technology, ICT, across the whole economy, especially in service industries that used ICT. U.S. productivity growth in those areas just blew past Japan's.
And the institutional difference there.
It came down to skills again. The U.S. was much better at widening the base of computer engineers. It developed a strong computer science discipline in universities and tapped into a huge pool of software engineers who could do the more routine, application-focused work needed for widespread ICT adoption.
And Japan.
Japanese universities were just very slow to adapt their training to meet the soaring demand for software engineers. The stats show it. In 1995, the U.S. had about 40% more universities per capita, providing baseline quality software engineering education than Japan did.
Another case of the crucial, broad skill base for diffusion. Okay, this historical tour really sets the stage. Let's bring it home to today. The Fourth Industrial Revolution, AI, U.S.-China competition. The headlines are all about who's ahead in AI innovation, R&D spending, patents.
Exactly. And this focus, Ding warns, risks us learning the wrong lessons all over again. Because AI looks like the most important general-purpose technology of our era. Studies of research papers, even preprints, show deep learning follows that classic GPT pattern, broad potential, impact realized over time through diffusion.
So the real race isn't just who invents the next AI breakthrough.
But who can effectively diffuse AI across their economy? That's where the long-term productivity gains and economic power shifts are likely to come from, if history is any guide.
Okay, so based on this deep dive into diffusion being the key driver, how do the US and China actually stack up right now for this AI-driven transition? What does the evidence suggest?
Well, it suggests a picture quite different from the common narrative of China rapidly overtaking the U.S. in AI. China's national AI strategy has largely followed that old leading sector playbook,
How so?
prioritizing indigenous innovation in specific frontier areas, like in the Made in China 2025 plan, aiming for leadership in specific high-tech manufacturing. But from a diffusion perspective, the analysis suggests China is far from being an AI superpower.
Really? Despite all the investment and focus?
Yeah. Look at the broader ICT Development Index, a measure of digital readiness. China ranks way down at 83rd globally. The U.S. is 15th. And studies show Chinese businesses have actually been pretty slow in adopting digital transformation compared to other major economies.
That's a significant gap in the foundation needed for AI diffusion. What specific data points on AI itself support this view?
The book presents some really striking numbers. First, AI engineers. Across key areas, the U.S. has a significant lead, like 14 times more engineers in chips and processors, 3 times more in natural language processing, twice as many in machine learning applications, 3 times more in computer vision. Overall, the U.S. has about twice as many AI practitioners.
So not just the very top researchers, but the broader pool of implementers.
Exactly. It challenges that narrative about China's sheer volume of STEM graduates, because the skill level and specialization seem higher in the U.S. pool. Then look at university training. In 2020-21, 159 U.S. universities met a baseline quality standard for AI or software engineering research, compared to only 29 in China. Again, a big gap in the foundational training infrastructure.
And the link between academia and industry.
That's the third piece, academic-industrial linkages. The U.S. leads globally in these hybrid academic corporate AI publications, more than double China's number. That suggests stronger pathways for getting research into practice, for systematizing that engineering knowledge. Plus, China's state-led approach to setting technical standards for AI might actually hinder its adoption across the economy if those standards aren't perfectly aligned with market needs.
Okay, so if I'm weaving this all together, the argument is that the real ownership of the future with AI won't come from just having the most advanced labs with the biggest R&D budget,
Right.
but from the widespread engineering optimization of AI, getting it embedded across countless sectors, powered by a deep bench of skilled practitioners. Is that the core message for today?
That sums it up perfectly. It's about appreciating the humble undertaking of diffusion as the real engine of long-term economic power. Not always as flashy, but arguably much more decisive.
This whole deep dive has been, well, pretty paradigm shifting for me, actually. I hope for you listening, too. The big takeaway seems to be that the rise and fall of great economic powers It's not primarily about the initial splashy invention or grabbing monopoly profits in a few leading sectors.
Yeah, the narrative is powerful, but maybe misleading.
Instead, it really comes down to the nitty-gritty of widespread diffusion of these general-purpose technologies and building that often invisible GPT skill infrastructure, the education systems, the networks, the standards that train and connect armies of ordinary engineers and technicians to actually apply the technology across the whole economy.
It's about building broad technical literacy, not just funding a few pockets of genius.
Which means focusing on that humble undertaking of diffusion, like you said, maybe more than the impressive and flashy R&D achievements.
And if you connect that to today's policy debates, you see policymakers, arguably in both the U.S. and China, still seem very focused on R&D dollars, patents, innovation leadership, that LS model.
They might be optimizing for the wrong thing.
They might be misreading the lessons of history, potentially prioritizing the sizzle over the steak, if you like, focusing on breakthroughs when the real long-term advantage comes from breadth and depth of application.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Given everything we've explored today about diffusion being the real driver, how might you start to rethink those headlines about the US-China tech race or any national innovation strategy? What's the invisible infrastructure, the skills, the connections, the practical know-how that countries really need to be building right now to secure their economic future in this age of AI?